Cool. Well, welcome everyone to a new episode 73 of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm joined by my friend Alan Hansen. He was on one of the earlier episodes dealing with Messiah Ben Joseph traditions, and about a year ago, you and Brad Whitbeck were on this channel discussing the Arabian gold plates, and I thought it was a very fun discussion you two guys had. So,
Yeah, whatever happened to those, I don't know.
yeah, it just they disappeared shortly afterwards. I haven't heard anything from them since then. But today we will be expanding a bit upon Alan's presentation for the FAIR online conference not too long ago, dealing with issues vis-a-vis Alexander Neibaur, who's a really fascinating fellow, the Kabbalah slash Zohar, and Joseph Smith. So before we kind of delve into this, like Alan, I know you're a returning guest, but how about you give an introduction to yourself, like your background in the church, your education,
Yeah,
and also what got you interested in this very niche, very interesting but very niche
yes,
topic?
very, very niche indeed. So I was born and raised in Israel. My parents, both members of the church, my grandparents on my dad's side joined. My mom's side been in church for dog's years. And yeah, so I grew up in Israel. I grew up in the north. I was actually born in a town which was one of the major Kabbalah centers several hundred years ago, and now there's still a ton of people. Um, Lots of things to do with the holidays. There's just basically where I grew up. One of my teachers was a Kabbalah, so that was interesting to me. And it just once I was back from my mission, I just started reading a bunch of it, anything I get my hands on. And years later, here we are.
Oh, that's perfect. So how about you maybe give, you probably will be doing this in the slideshow, but like, how about you kind of give a TLD or summary version, like say the Michael Quinn slash all perspective on the influence of the Zohar slash Kabbalah on Joseph Smith?
Yes, this claim kind of started around the 80s. It wasn't really developed until the 90s with Lance Owens. He published an article in Dialogue on Joe Smith and the Kabbalah where he claimed that Joseph Smith was taught Kabbalah by Alexander Neibaur, a convert, and the King Follett discourse is based on a passage of the Zohar, which is a Kabbalistic book. And then Michael Quinn ran with that. He revised his Mormonism magic worldview to argue that it also influenced the Book of Mormon. That was one of the sources for it, according to Quinn. And this claim was picked up by a lot of people who weren't members of the church. Several Jewish scholars who specialize in Kabbalah ran with that also. So it's kind of it's a bit obscure, but it does have some academic legitimacy.
And I'm sure like some people will be wondering like, what's your qualifications when it comes to this? So can you actually read the original language texts and actually have you studied this and so forth? Basically, just in case someone says like you're just a
Oh yeah.
random guy. But yeah.
Well, I am a
If you want,
random guy,
if you want
but
to
I have
flex, if you want to flex a bit, go ahead. So
okay. So yeah, I've got several hundred books on this topic in Hebrew, Aramaic, English.
by the way, I can actually attest this because I've been to his house when I was in Utah.
Yeah, I can even show some. Let's see. I've got quite a few right here. So yeah, I've studied the original sources probably more in depth than anyone else in the church. And that's why I'm also pretty familiar with the academic literature. I had a presentation on parallels between Joe Smith and the Hasidic leader about 12 years ago. Elliot Wolfson, scholar, was there also, had good things to say about it. So I know a little bit about it, we could say.
Yeah, just in case someone was wondering, like, but Stephen Fleming says otherwise. Okay, well, you were kind enough to email me this morning my time a presentation that you'll be
Yeah.
using. As I said, I put it on Dropbox and it's in the show notes. So anyone who wants to download it and go through it, feel free to. So if you want to start your PowerPoint, we can go through it. Maybe if we have some time afterwards and
Yeah.
some audience have questions, we can go through that as well. But yeah,
Yeah, and if they have questions throughout at any point, we can always stop and go through
yeah, I'll let you
the
know when
ones
that
we missed during.
happens.
Yeah. All right. Let me pull up the screen share here.
Hopefully, no boomer tech moment.
Yes, won't be won't be more than a moment here. Let's see. Sorry, it's always a pain. There we go. All right. Oh, God. All right. And apologies in advance for the PowerPoint. It isn't my strong suit, but it'll have to do. All right. So why as LDS should we even care about this topic? It's just basically obscure Jewish teachings, very arcane, very difficult. But there's two reasons here. One, we can actually learn quite a bit about ancient traditions. Some of them were more underground, only appear in later sources. Other times, Kabbalistic works are really good at getting to the heart of what was being taught anciently that might not be as obvious. And there's also some really interesting phenomenological points. Even if there's not a direct historical connection, they've got a lot about things like white garments and robes making you as the angels during the Sabbath or becoming like the high priest. So you can see there's a lot we can apply to temple just as by way of comparison. The other reason, like we talked a bit about about this in the beginning, is so many critics have started to run with this idea and to use it as a way of undermining the truth claims of the church and Joseph's prophetic calling. Michael Quinn even revised his book in order to include a lot more on that and claimed that it was the source of the Book of Mormon. So it is in our interest to become familiar with this and address criticisms and also increase our understanding of scriptures. Now, the problem with the claims that Joseph Smith were influenced by Kabbalah or things like that is they don't follow expected rules of evidence or their historical methodology. Critics like Michael Quinn didn't take the time to explore how readily available works like Hannah Adams were, what you could learn from that, or other books on the Jews they said that contained that information. When I went through several of the library catalogs, Hannah Adams' book, for example, was hardly available anywhere. It's one of those where you had to know people to get a copy, and Joseph didn't move in those kind of circles much. There would be nothing wrong if Joseph were influenced by it. History is what it is. But we gotta be careful with these claims. And not to pick on Stephen Fleming, who I'm sure is a wonderful guy, but he has some really strange ideas about environmental influence. And when you insist on close and direct parallels to any given text, and you're talking about influence, then you do bear a burden of proving that. And then the details really get important. Does the text say anything like what it's claimed? Does a parallel stand up? And things like that. And it's not a question of is it okay for Joseph to be influenced by sources other than the Bible? It's a question of was he? What can we show? If a parallel appears in the Bible, a work that we know Joseph had and used, then that should get precedence from a historical point of view unless you have compelling evidence to the otherwise. Just pointing out similarities isn't going to cut it. And there's another interesting parallel here that with the poet William Blake, a lot of people have claimed that he was influenced by various forms of the Kabbalah. But as the scholar Jonathan Garb pointed out, you can't let influences overtake genius or individual innovation. So even if you don't believe Joe Smith was a prophet the way we do, you can still benefit from using a little bit more rigorous methodology and accepting that there are some things that he personally innovated. Or if you are a believer, we can just call that revelation, which is basically what it is. But the secular form of that would be individual innovation. That's true for Blake, that's true for Joseph Smith. And now, the Kabbalah did not appear in a vacuum out of nowhere. It's got really deep roots. So the esoteric core of Judaism, what we know late First Temple and from early Second Temple onwards, we find that it's interested in several things. Creation of the world, the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, and their fall, but then also things like the earthly and heavenly temple, which is also where God dwells. So that's where you get kind of literature called the Hechalot, which is the heavenly palaces, and involves people going up to see God. They have to pass through all the angels on the way. They have to know names of power and other things that they can get past them. Hopefully, observant listeners are noticing what we go through in the temple, what Brigham Young said about passing sentinels, because it's very much rooted in that kind of tradition. And they want to get a glimpse of God on his throne or his chariot, the Merkabah. So names of God, names of power, they're really important. There's also a lot of speculation on the form of God's body, which is usually gigantic flames, but at an early stage, pretty much everyone believed that God had a physical body. Hebrew letters are part of what make up the names of God, the power, and they're the instruments of the vessels with which he creates the world and keeps feeding his influence into it and blessings. You have really, really well-developed angelologies with angels who are pointed over different roles. There's even cases of people praying to them, appealing to them. They fill a big role there. In cases of Enoch, Metatron, and others, you have humans turning into divine beings or angels. And you find different configurations of these beliefs all throughout early Judaism. Even in supposedly irrationalists like Philo of Alexandria, you get a lot of this speculation on the cherubs and the ark. And Kabbalah preserves a lot of these. It changes them, but it preserves things. So, for example, there's quite the synagogue mosaic here. This is from Beit Alpha in north of Israel. I've been there actually a few times. These are charmingly naive mosaics that actually took a lot of money and effort to make. Up. But it depicts the sun in a chariot, which is also connected to God and some of the patriarchs, such as Jacob. But following Ezekiel's vision of a chariot, that became a central image in Jewish mysticism, and it was how mystics express their idea of God and his interactions with the world. So I've got a couple of quotes up here. One is from Joseph Dunn saying that these continued to be of interest to all trends and tendencies within Jewish culture. These were images that stuck till today, in fact. And below that, I've got a quote from a mid-19th century Hasidic master, and he used the image of the chariot to talk about the problem of good and evil. And it's really interesting if you look into it, because the chariot's in the world closest to ours, and that's the closest interaction we humans get with God, basically, is that idea. Hey, if you don't mind a little bit of self-promotion, as you know, there's going to be a conference in May at BYU organized by Interpreter and several others, including Scriptural Cent, sorry, Scripture Center, Central. I don't know why I can't say it today. Yeah, Jeffrey Bradshaw and others organized it. There's going to be talks from Gary Rensburg. Sam Zinner is going to have one also dealing with the Kabbalah. But Spencer Krause and myself, we've got a paper on the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their children, how they're considered divine beings, and connected with the stars and planets. So we actually go through quite a bit of Kabbalah and other Jewish mystical texts to show how this idea stretches for centuries and centuries in Judaism and lets us understand how to read Abraham 3 and figure out who Kolob is. Yeah, it's been great stuff. Stephen Smoot and Abraham as an astronomer, Spencer Krause and myself again in Book of Jasher. There'll be a lot of good stuff there. All right. So the Kabbalah,
Well, I'm sorry, Alan, but I don't
yeah,
think like the slides are actually showing.
they're not. Oh,
It's
goodness.
still on the following Ezekiel's vision, the chart
Huh.
Merkabah.
Let me try this again, okay? Let me see what's going on. I didn't get too far past that slide. Okay, this is showing now.
Yes, it's shown the upcoming
Okay.
Weber one.
Yeah, all right, good. So yeah, with this one, I really recommend people check it out. There's a stellar lineup, and there's going to be a lot of amazing things there. At least two of the papers deal substantially with Kabbalah. Ours and Samuel Zinner, who's really a brilliant scholar also. Yeah, now with Kabbalah, basically it's a form of inquiry into the secrets and mysteries of the Godhead, who God is, and how he interacts with the world. And there's such a wide range of symbolism that you can read a text like the Bible and open up a lot of insights into God because these symbols are more than just symbols. Like some people think symbolism means an object isn't real or literal. In Kabbalah, it's completely different. For example, if there's a poor person, he's identified with one of the lower forms of the Godhead, and helping him by charitable acts helps not only him, but also causes a change for the better in the Godhead above and helps bring about the unity between its different configurations. So pretty much, I'd say 80–90% of the Kabbalah is understanding their system of symbolism. Letters of the alphabet, those are things that express hidden truths and powers of the Godhead in a visible form. If you put the letters together in different shapes, you have access to different forms of God's power. Now, something very radically different from what we believe is transmigration of souls, or Gilgul. Owens actually thought that Alexander Neibaur's paper in Times and Seasons was talking about this, but he read it completely wrong. But basically, if you die and there's still things that you need to have done, you'll be reincarnated to fill another commandment or to elevate sparks of light. And once these are all elevated, you achieve redemption. That's why prayers are really important. You got to use the right intent in them so they have the desired effect on the unity of the Godhead. Another thing where we differ a lot is that God or Ein Sof is the unmoved mover, the cause of causes. You can only say things about him by negation. You can't say what it is, you can only say what he's not. He's not corporeal. He has no body parts or passions, you might say. As such, evil emanates from him, but it became separated and took on a life of its own. And so that has to be vanquished and brought back into its proper sphere. And then the problem of evil is overcome and redemption arrives. There's also a lot of sexual imagery in the Kabbalah, and that comes from parts in the Bible where God expresses his love to Israel in terms of earthly love, and then the Song of Songs, where Israel expresses that back to God. A lot of the doctrine of marriage in the Kabbalah is fascinating and comes from this basic concept. Kind of this last concept here is about the transmission of Kabbalistic knowledge. Books were important, but even more important than that was having a proper teacher who was steeped in the tradition and in the mainstream normative Judaism and could steer you away from erroneous interpretations. We don't have any indication of that for Neibaur, which is another important clue that he wasn't really teaching Joseph Kabbalah. Okay, this is a pretty simplified diagram, and it's in fact missing a line, should be going from the top one, Keter, all the way down to Tiferet, Yesod, and Malchut. This is a Kabbalistic tree, but a common misconception that I really want to set straight, especially for an LDS audience, is that this is not the tree of life. Tree just means a schema or diagram. It was a medieval term. Latin Christianity also used it, had similar configurations. Like, for example, you know the diagram of this, the Son is not the Father, is not the Holy Ghost, is not the Son, right?
Yep.
That's that comes from the medieval concept just like that. So we got to cool our jets a little. This is not the tree of life. The tree of life appears as a symbol in Kabbalah, but it's a bit different and has a different role there. And for example, on the left, you can see the earliest diagram we know of isn't shaped like a tree at all. It's in fact emanating from the center in a big circle. The top three, Keter Bina Chochmah, they are the ones that create the rest of them. Keter, there's a lot of debate whether it's the highest God or just a form emanated from him, but it's the top form of God that we have some sort of visualization for. And from it come the rest. You have Chokhmah, which is wisdom, and that acts like the father. Binah is understanding, acts a bit like the mother. So they basically together they create their children, which are the other six. Chesed, that's compassion or love, and is often identified with Abraham. Gevurah, which is power, prowess, aggression, strength, that's identified with harsh or strict justice. And between them, there's a lot of tension. If you have too much love in the world, it will be destroyed. If you have too much judgment, it'll also be destroyed. It's a bit like when the Book of Mormon talks about mercy robbing justice. Gevurah is Isaac, and in between you have Tiferet, which is a kind of splendor, and that's Jacob, and he mediates between them and is called mercy. So with a combination of love and justice, you get mercy. And he is directly connected to Keter as well. So Jacob is a really big deal. He combines the qualities of his father and his grandfather together. And that's how God shows mercy in the world. It's also the four-letter name, Jehovah. It can be used of all of them, but it especially means this one here. Then you have Netzach, which is eternity and victory, and Hod, glory, and those are two knees. They're Moses and Aaron. And they're mediated by Yesod or foundation, which is Joseph. And below that you have Malchut, which is kingdom or or sovereignty, and that's David. And this is the one that's closest to us and the one that gets all of its powers from all the others, none of its own. These are also seen as God's body, with the top three being the head. Then you have the arms, the navel, the legs and knees, the male genitals, and the female ones. And they're all connected that way. So when we talk about Sefirot, this is what they are. And this is central teaching in most of the Kabbalah. Okay. There's so many different books of the Kabbalah, but three that we've got to know are the Sefer Yetzirah, the Behir, and the Zohar. So Sefer Yetzirah, we have no idea when or where or how or why it was written. There's well over 1,000 year gap. Not gap, I mean, there's well over 1,000 year spectrum of when it could have been written. It suddenly appears out of nowhere in about the 10th century or so. There might be hints to it earlier, and some scholars think the majority of it was written in the first few centuries AD or the last few centuries BC. It talks about how God used letters and numbers and stars and everything to create the universe. Many of the basic concepts of Kabbalah are found here, even though this is not a Kabbalistic book. It influenced philosophers as much as it did Kabbalists and others. Tradition ascribes it to Abraham, and that also seems to be what the book itself is saying. And there's some cool parallels to the Book of Abraham, but you're going to have to wait till Spencer and mine's presentation for those. Yeah, this was a big one that influenced every Kabbalist almost after it. The Bahir, or the Book of Illumination, despite its name, it's one of the most obscure and obtuse and difficult books in Judaism to read. It basically is a form of mystical midrash and parables. No single work in Judaism uses as many parables as this one does, and they're all very, very complicated. You've got some, for example, that make so little sense that people think there must be a Zen kind of thing going on there. I don't think that's quite the case, but it's a book that one scholar has said it's thinking in images and impressions rather than simple logical patterns. But so much of the Kabbalah, the ideas, come from this book, even though it's not organized or very methodical like other books. Unfortunately, there isn't a good English translation of the majority of it that's easily available. There's an Italian scholar who translated a Latin translation of it, which is really good, but almost impossible to find for love or money. So Kaplan's book is not one I'd recommend. So unfortunately, until we get a proper translation that's accessible, it's going to be harder to study this one. It also contained, oh, before I go back, it also contained some Jewish Christian traditions, such as its teachings on the Tree of Life. But it seems to have come together somewhere between the 10th and 12th centuries. We don't know where, if there was one author or many. All right, and you probably noticed some of these Jewish books have a thing for pillars and gates. And these are meant to represent the temple. So just like with Masons, you have the two pillars of Solomon's temple here. But yeah, that was a common design for this kind of book. But now we've reached the Zohar. This is the number one book of Kabbalah. It it eclipsed the Bahir that came before it, and it's still widely read and studied till this day. Now, it claims to be a book from the second or third century AD, and it's presenting the esoteric teachings of the Talmudic sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, or Rashbi as he's known. And he and his son fled from the Romans. He lived in a cave, and that's where they received visits from Elijah, revelation from above. And he became, in the Zohar, he's presented as a new Moses, as someone's presenting the hidden teachings on God and the scriptures and helps us attain the heavenly mysteries and those splendors. So just a moment. There you go. Throat getting a bit dry. So he and his companions teach each other. They spend a lot of time walking, meeting up in various caves, running across mysterious strangers. You never know if the donkey or mule driver that you come across is actually a secret sage or holy man or even an angel in disguise. And they learn all sorts of secrets about God and how to read the scriptures. Now, as a book, it was written most likely sometime in Spain in the 13th century. Older theories that was written by a single author basically don't have a leg to stand on anymore. It was likely composed by a group of friends and students. We don't know if they were getting what they thought were revelations, if it was purely pseudepigraphia. It's a really complicated issue. But no two manuscripts of this book are the same. It really only became a book in the 16th century when you had two rival editions printed in Italy, and that set the form of the book as we have it now. But some parts may go back several centuries before. And Zohar, it means splendor, and it uses the image of light from the book of Daniel. Those who are wise and understand receive heavenly light. It really is an amazing book to read. It can be very confusing, but Daniel Matt's got a terrific translation. You can read it all in English now and with fantastic annotations, commentary. There shouldn't be an excuse not to be familiar, at least with basic teachings from it. Now, you might ask, who had access to it? Ezra Stiles. He probably had com the only copy that was permanently in the US until 1900 or so. I had written one of the special collections in Harvard to see if they had any other copies that were 19th century, and they said no, most of the Judaica comes after 1900. Ezra Stiles had to order his from London. It took him several years to buy it, and that cost 22 pounds, 6 shillings. At about the same time, in Hartford, Connecticut, for example, if your estate was valued at 25 pounds a year or less, you were living in poverty. So the Zohar cost almost as much as someone's entire household. The only other copies that were in the Americas were carried there by traveling rabbis, emissaries collecting money for Jews in Israel, and they left with them. So Joseph would not have had any access to it unless he had it through Alexander Neibaur. And I've pretty much shown that that's unlikely to be the case. So did William Hamlin, but we'll get to that in a moment. Okay. Now I'll just try to go briefly over the history, but we only see the Kabbalah appear in southern France in the late 12th century. We just don't know much of it before. We know that it probably started a few generations prior. They incorporated midrash and philosophy into their understanding of God and the prayers and rituals. The temple plays an extremely important part in the teachings of these early Kabbalistic sages. So the temple and the holy names and the angels are what brought about Kabbalah as we know it today. Late 13th century, we have the Zohar appear in Spain. 1492, the Jews of Spain are expelled. They scatter all over the world. It was a major traumatic event because Spain was the heart of Jewish philosophy, Jewish halakha, which is the teaching how to follow the commandments and fulfill them, and it was center of Kabbalah. So it was a huge loss economically, culturally, and that caused Kabbalah to spread and brought about messianic expectations in the next few centuries. So the intellectual weight of the Jewish world shifts to the Ottoman Empire. Italy is a major center as well. That's where most of the early printed books come from. The biggest names we need to know after the Zohar appeared is Vieri, Rabbi Isaac Luria, who lived in the town where I was born in Israel, in Sfat, and he created a new system of Kabbalah based on his reading of the Zohar and other things. This Baroque structure is impossibly arcane and dense and difficult. It takes the complicated symbols of Kabbalah and complicates them even further. His main student, Chaim Vital, was also a doctor and a physician, and I read a book recently which argues very convincingly that this form of Kabbalah was based on concepts of medicine and early psychology, which they applied both to man's soul and to God. So the Kabbalist acts as a physician who's supposed to heal God and the world. And so he does that by understanding the various forms of the body which are configured as faces, beards, eyes, arms, and so on. He knows the remedy for it, and he helps bring about the desired unity. One of the theoretical teachings is the idea of tzimtzum or contraction. God filled the immensity of space in the world, and there was no space for anything there but him. So he contracts his divine light, he brings it into himself, and then he sends it out in a more narrow, concentrated form. While he was doing that, the vessels that conveyed the light couldn't contain them, they shattered. It was a separation of good and evil. Sparks of holiness fell among the evil husks, and they have to be elevated and redeemed back to their proper place in the Godhead. So again, we do that by the prayers we say, by the holidays we observe, by the things we do every day. And redemption occurs when all the souls are gathered together in Adam's body and are connected to each other in their proper form and place. Now, we have some similar ideas in the early church with Joseph Smith teaching that. Orson Hyde has a diagram of how the kingdoms are supposed to be organized after that, which bears some similarities to this, even though the Kabbalistic doctrine of the soul is a lot different to ours. There's composite. We don't have that concept at all. Okay, at about the same time, in the Christian world, especially Italy, you have figures like Musile Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and others, and in France, Guillaume de Postel. They take the Kabbalah, oh, and Flavius Mithridates has translated these into Latin, but they take the Kabbalah and they view it as the true ancient teachings of the scriptures and they make it Christological. And the image you can see here is actually from a famous book called The Gates of Light, but this is the Latin edition. And this kind of Christian Kabbalah had tremendous influence on Western occultism and on Freemasonry. We really don't have time to delve much into that, but it's an important part of the story. Okay. Now, in the year 1665, there were shockwaves throughout the entire Jewish world, from Turkey to Holland to Morocco to Persia to Yemen, that the Messiah had finally appeared, and his name was Shabtai Tzvi. Non-Jews also watched this very closely. Lots of millenarians wondered if he was the Antichrist or what he was doing there. There's this big expectation for redemption. And Shabtai Tzvi, he had a lot of idiosyncrasies and mood swings. It was a form of divine madness. That's how people conceptualized it, which meant that he was close to God and received revelation straight from him. He was considered an incarnation of part of the Godhead, the Messiah, and all that. Kabbalah was very important to him. He helped popularize it, spread it among even women and children. He had lots of prophecies and things like that going on. He abrogated or broke a lot of the laws in ritual ways. For example, he'd eat unclean foods in the synagogue. Really, really shocking things, but most of the Jewish world followed him until he converted to Islam. Once he'd done that, the Sabbatean movement went underground. A lot of them went with him and became Muslim as well. Some of their descendants still live in Turkey to this day. They're called the Dünme. But the rest of Sabbateans in the Jewish world had to keep a low profile. These weren't just simple people that followed him, these were also some of the most important establishment figures. And the 18th century, Kabbalah finally becomes kind of a mass belief because you have all the popular prayer books use it. There's new holidays based on it, many customs, synagogue art, lots of itinerant preachers teaching radical ideas from that. Lurianic Kabbalah had been relatively minor before Sabbateanism caused it to be of interest and spread across the world. It remained a threat until the end of the 18th century. For a while, just as long as you kept things discreet and quiet to make a fuss about it, the rabbinic establishment wasn't going to draw attention to you, wasn't going to persecute you or anything like that. One of the most influential rabbis of that day and age was himself a Sabbatean who wrote one of the most shocking books on God and sexual ideas in Judaism. He got into a big fight with another rabbi and they had to call in non-Jewish authorities. It was quite a nasty business there. Eventually, they became Polish and German aristocracy and things and basically died out in Europe. At the same time, the 18th and 19th century, you had several new movements. We have the Hasidic Jews who followed the teachings of disciples of Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, who was a healer and mage. He used the he used the holy names of God to heal people, to find lost treasures. But he took a lot of the Kabbalistic ideas and made them a little more accessible to people, even if they had no education, as long as they cling to the holy man, the tzaddik. He could elevate their souls and repair them. He served as the pillar between earth and heaven. Some of the other Jews, who were themselves many of them Kabbalists, opposed them for various reasons. They're called the Mitnagdim, and they got into bad fights, snitching to the authorities, getting each other arrested, rioting, fighting, till that finally dies down in the mid-19th century. The Hasidic teachings take some elements from Kabbalah, but mostly focus on a lot of ethical ideas in radical ways, and their opponents thought that they were downplaying studying Torah or praying. And by the time Alexander Neibaur and Joe Smith come on the scene, the Kabbalah wasn't something of a retreat. You have all the internal struggles of orthodoxy. Torah study in the Lithuanian model becomes the dominant model. Kabbalah is not as prestigious anymore. It's the primary mode of cleaving to God is by studying the Talmud and other things. A lot of the main Kabbalists also moved to the land of Israel in preparation for the expected redemption in the year 1840, which coincides with Orson Hyde's visit a few months later. There's lots of interesting parallels there. We talked a little bit about them in the Messiah of Joseph video. And then when the Enlightenment, the Haskalah, started changing Jewish attitudes and values in Europe, Orthodox Jews poured their efforts into fighting against that. So they opposed the Haskalah, their modernizing trends, and Kabbalah got pushed to the side. Okay, so by the time we have Alexander Neibaur on the scene, he lived closer to Berlin than he lived to any of the Hasidic centers. There's not, there was hardly any Sabbatian or Hasidic activity there, despite what Owens claimed. It's just if you look there, you're only going to find one rabbi that was even close to Hasidic miracle worker, and he was an outsider. So chances of being influenced by those teachings very, very small. My fair presentation goes a little bit more over what I was able to find about his education, but there's simply no indication that he studied Kabbalah as such. He only spent a few years as a child and teenager studying, then he gave it up, became a dentist. And when he was a teen, he would have been studying tractates of the Talmud. Yeah, this is environmental influences. It's a very, very weak claim. Okay, this was a weak force in his area. It was unlikely to be any significant part of his education. Neibaur himself was close to Joseph Smith, but he was not part of the internal circle that Joseph taught the temple mysteries to, or anything like that. He doesn't appear in any of those lists that we know of. Okay, and the other big thing, remember I was saying that there was only one copy of the Zohar likely in the US? If Alexander Neibaur had that or any other Kabbalistic book, they would be extremely valuable and expensive. We don't have any trace of that. None. So that's a big obstacle that anyone that claims that he had these works has to overcome. Now, what Owens tried to do is look at an 1842 article in the Times and Seasons on the resurrection, which Alexander Neibaur wrote, including Jewish traditions. When I look through the list of works cited, these are the ones that I found that are actually Kabbalistic. Owens way overstated what was Kabbalistic and what was not. Now, a lot of the material appears in a book by Manasseh ben Israel, a Dutch rabbi of the 17th century, who was also convinced that lost tribes were in the Americas. But out of all these books, not one citation by Alexander Neibaur, in his article refers to Kabbalistic doctrines or the unique teachings on resurrections you'd find in those books. I mean, one of them, Emek HaMelech, that one at the very beginning of the book has something about the hidden temple treasure and really fascinating things like that. And you don't find any trace of that in Joe Smith teachings or Alexander Neibaur's writings. It's like, why would you take the most boring, mundane, vanilla things out of these books unless you didn't really have them and these were just excerpts of the exoteric material in one of the many popular compendiums? So even though we still don't know of a book, it's a lot easier to misplace one book or a notebook that you might have copied at an earlier date than a big Kabbalistic library. So even the Times and Seasons article is not a strong indicator that Alexander Neibaur knew Kabbalah, let alone introduced Joseph Smith to a passage of the Zohar which catalyzed the King Follett discourse. Owens, Quinn, Fleming, anyone else who advocates for this is out to lunch, I'm afraid. All elements of the King Follett discourse, we can trace them to internal theological developments, such as Book of Abraham or Doctrine and Covenants, section 76. The whole framework is in there and is in Joe Smith's Hebrew textbooks. And we'll see that in a moment. There's almost no imagery from the Zohar in the passage that Owen says influenced Joseph Smith, which is that in the beginning, the head god called forth the council. He claims that it matches a passage in the Zohar. My fair presentation goes over that in a tremendous amount of detail. I actually provide a close reading of the Zohar passage in question, and there's practically no similarity at all, and in fact directly contradicts what Joe Smith was claiming. Other things, like the idea of Jesus following in his Father's footsteps to become incarnated and come to this earth, you cannot find that easily in the Zohar at all. But it is accounted for by New Testament passages, such as "You've seen me, you've seen the Father." So the Zohar cannot be a good source of Joe Smith's Christology in this at all. All the conceptual elements, they were already in place before Neibaur set one foot in the Americas. So he's not a good source for any of this. If you want to apply the naturalistic theories, it just doesn't work that way. Okay. Now, in my fair presentation, I ran out of time. I want to go over a really interesting part of the King Follett discourse. So in that sermon, he talks about how you need to know James's real name. The New Testament says James. Now, if Jacob had the keys, you might talk about James and never get the keys. We know that keys is a concept which Joe Smith even used in wider ways than we do today, but it meant authority and power and identity with the figure bearing those keys. Samuel Brown says Smith emphasized the power of names rightly understood. That's plenty of parallels to the Kabbalah. But there's no indication that he got it directly from the Kabbalah. Masonry is a likelier environmental influence. If we're looking at how we organize the endowment, we have direct compelling evidence that he used parts of Masonry for the endowment. And so names were important there. But what Joseph Smith is saying here, the name is integral to the identity of the bearer of the keys. He looked at the German, I think because it was phonetic. because you wouldn't say James, they use Jacob, but in German it would be Jakob. If you get the name wrong like that and you're counting on reading the Bible to give you the keys and power you need, you would be mistaking the apostle for someone else, someone without the right keys. And Sam Brown also rightly points out that the logic undergirding the King Follett discourse was the logic of the temple. This was very much on his mind in his last days. The sermon was given in full view of the temple being constructed. He was worried that it would not be completed and set right before his death. Luckily, Brigham Young was able to pull through and endow so many people before they had to flee west. But if we look at direct Kabbalistic parallels, we're going to misinterpret what was going on in the sermon. So at very best, you can claim Kabbalah as an indirect influence through Masonry. That's about it. I mentioned his Hebrew materials. Benjamin McGuire pointed out years ago that if you look at Seixas's grammar, you see that he has for Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, he created God. Then right next to that, you can read in the lexicon that he was using that Rosh is a head, a chief leader, a person, individual, and Reshit is first in its kind. So here we have, in really visual form, exactly what Joseph needed and would have used for his understanding of Genesis 1:1. He was taking stuff that he already knew and using his newfound Hebrew skills to express the truth. You don't need the Kabbalah for this. You don't need the Zohar or any text from it. That was staring Joseph right in the face. Genesis 1:1 is a notoriously difficult and idiosyncratic text. It's very hard. It's very hard to parse, right? There's a lot, it's open to a lot of interpretations and it has a long history of being interpreted in many ways. One Moroccan Kabbalist, in fact, had about 200 different interpretations for this one verse. So there's simply no compelling reason to see the Zohar as the source, and a lot against it. Okay. You know, there's one other part. This is my personal favorite parallel that I think I'm the first one to notice between the King Follett sermon and Kabbalistic teachings. So one of Joseph's most controversial things in the King Follett discourse, this is why later leaders like his nephew Joseph F. Smith were hesitant and reluctant to accept it, is his teachings on infants who die and are crowned on thrones and remain children for their mothers to come and be their mothers throughout eternity. Infant mortality was a tragedy that struck pretty much every family in the 19th century. Joseph Smith endured such child loss himself multiple times. Even if you yourself hadn't lost an infant, someone in your family or your neighbors did. So as part of this sermon, he comforted grieving mothers in the assembled crowd. And that's why he told them they'd have their children in eternity. Now, what's really interesting is that the Zohar and other Kabbalistic texts also face that tragedy of children's deaths. There's one Zohar passage which says that something to the effect that the biggest tears in the world are the tears over the children that die prematurely. Kabbalists were themselves family men. Judaism was not really monastic. So these were people that lost their own children. Rabbi Isaac Luria lost his own son. He thought it was a punishment for revealing too many secrets to his disciples. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov in the early 19th century lost his son, who was supposed to be a Messiah that would combine Moses and the Messiah ben Joseph. But his son died, and redemption did not come by the year 1819 or 1820 in Judaism. Now, the Zohar teaches that there is an academy in the heavens where the children go. Metatron teaches them the day, and then at night they go up to God to be in His glory and study from Him. In a text, the Seder of Paradise, or the Order of Paradise, we encounter a figure called Rabbi Gadiel the Youth. Now, this is a child who was orphaned from his parents, and he spent some time hidden in a cave studying Torah at a time when maybe the Romans, text doesn't say, were forbidding Torah study. He was discovered and murdered and martyred. God placed him at the head of a heavenly academy where he presides in glory. He teaches the righteous the deepest secrets and mysteries of the Torah. He's a youth, which is another of the names associated with Metatron. And he's associated directly with the four-letter name of God. So he's a figure that represents God. Okay, and he's described as being in the highest firmament, shining like the light of the firmament, with 70 angels encompassing him, 50 keys in his hands, and groups of the righteous before him, and the letters of the ineffable name gleaming upon his head. And the appearance was like that of the rainbow, which in Ezekiel 1 is a description of the divine figure upon the throne. So we have here a child who remains a child, but he's crowned in glory, and he sits on a throne. So it's very interesting parallel to what Joseph was teaching. Now, Gadiel, the name means Agnus Dei, or the Lamb of God. It's pretty much a direct translation of that. Scholars have noticed that there's a lot of Christian messianic and redemptive parallels, which are probably deliberately taken over from Christianity and appropriated in order to present this figure. Now, this same midrash states that the souls of other departed children remain children. They are shown the highest honors by God Himself. So you have this really fascinating array of texts and allusions to infants on thrones in glory. But there are too many hurdles to imagine that Joseph got this from an obscure Kabbalistic text that wasn't even published in an accessible edition until about the same time that he was a Navur dying. It would have had a way to get to him. So the evidentiary and bibliographic hurdles are insurmountable, and you don't even need them to explain something which actually grows pretty naturally out of Joseph's cosmology. So we don't need those explanations, and they don't help. That they're pretty weak. So the claim that Joseph Smith either interacted with directly or was inspired in any meaningful way by the Kabbalah is untenable, no matter how cool I think it would be. Just no facet of early Mormon history or doctrine can be better explained by such a connection, and that's what we have to face. Thank you.
Okay, well, that was fun. As I said, the slides are on the show notes, so people can actually download them and go through them as well, because that's pretty informative. And I think this is like a very good pairing with the fair presentation you gave. And
Thank you.
also,
Just
I
gotta
do
stop
appreciate the fact.
sharing.
Yeah, I also
Yeah.
do appreciate the fact you said, like, there's no meaningful parallels, although it would be cool if there was. So, like, you're not
Oh yeah.
living under some a priori assumption that there cannot be, or if there were any meaningful parallels, it's game over. It's like,
No.
because, like, I'm sure, like, if you were, like, say, methodologically, if someone were to write an article and they were to show, like, this idea did come from, say, the Kabbalah through Neibaur, it's like, cool. It wouldn't be like,
Yeah, I'd love it.
yeah. I think analogous would be like, say, whether Adam Clark's commentary translation did influence the JST. I mean, in principle, I have nothing against it, and others like Ken Jackson, in principle, have nothing against it. Just like,
Yeah.
I just don't think there's very good evidence. So, as an analogous, it would be like that.
Exactly. We have to look at what kind of evidence there is. And maybe there is a connection, but some things just cannot be demonstrated well. But a good principle of any solid, proper historian is you look at what, first of all, you look at what you know, what you can trace to someone. Works that you know they hadn't used take precedence in any kind of analysis. If you can't explain it through that, or can't explain it sufficiently, then you can point to parallels, but you have to do the legwork and actually argue for it. You can't just wave your hand and assert it.
No, that's a good point. Okay, we only have really one audience question, so and this is from Hunter Toma. Does Alan have any thoughts on Paul taking up any of these traditions, specifically the Merkabah and Helical traditions, when he describes ascending up to different levels of heaven? And that's a reference to Paul going up to
Yeah,
the third heaven, 2 Corinthians.
well, absolutely. There's been some really good works on that. Alan,
Alan
yeah,
Segal,
Alan Segal has a book on Paul the Convert.
great book.
There's a great chapter on that where he argues that yes, Paul had a sort of Merkava type of ascent and vision to God, and that caused his conversion. And so then he goes to sociological aspects of conversion. You have, was it Christopher Rowland who wrote a book on Jewish mystic traditions, apocalypticism, and Christian teachings, New Testament. You also have Crispin Fletcher Lewis on similar things. Yeah, there's quite a lot that explains it. We've got to be careful not to, sometimes we've got to be careful not to import later ideas, but in Judaism, that is complicated. It's not straightforward.
Yeah, there's a couple of good studies. Paula Gooder, only the third heaven question mark, 2 Corinthians 12, 1 to 10, and the heavenly ascents. And yeah, it was part of the New Testament Library
Yeah,
series.
and
You can,
Qumran has heavenly ascents also.
oh yeah, loads.
Yeah, so that's pretty solid. There's a lot there. There's a lot to be done in the traditions about Jacob as a demiurge or angel. Spencer Mine's interpretive presentation at the conference is going into that quite a bit more. But early Christians as well as early Jews, they believed that Jacob was a divine figure and he filled pretty much the same role that we see being ascribed to Christ.
Cool. Okay, any other questions? Okay, Andy Young. Um, Still have plans to review Key to the Keystone and would be a good resource for an episode on that. So, how's the review
We'll
going?
see. It's going pretty well. I had to focus on getting a couple of papers in for a deadline, so I had to take a back burner, but that's on again now. And it's not that I've got anything personal against anyone there, it's just that it's one of these books that has a lot of errant ideas and will cause a lot more harm in understanding the scriptures than it does good.
Well, thanks, Andy, for the question. There's no other question, but like you did mention like Sabbatai Savi, so and he's a really
Yeah.
fascinating fellow, so a bit tangential, but if someone wanted to like say delve into like Sabbaty himself and or the Sabbateanism movement, any recommended works and hopefully in English.
Oh yeah. So there's some really good ones that have appeared in English. I'm putting together, halfway finished it. I was hoping to have it ready for today, but I'm putting together just a recommended list of books on the Kabbalah that I think people can access and learn more about it. Sabbateanism is one of my big passions to study. I have one of the biggest libraries on it, personal private libraries in the Intermountain West, I think between here and California. So here are books that I'd recommend if you want to get into that. Gershom Scholem's Doorstopper, Sabbatai the Mystical Messiah, is still the number one book to read. Some of his ideas, like the spread of Lurianism, is what caused Sabbatianism. Later scholars show they got it backwards, but it's still, and he does a little too much of um, psychobabble in it. He did write it throughout the 40s and 50s, but it's still the best single work on that. Pavel Matsieko, he has through Brandeis, he published an anthology with some text on that. Another good one would be, oh, Chingiz, what's his name? There's a Turkish scholar who wrote a book on Sabtai and the Dünme in Turkey. It was published in English. I can get you the title. That one's really good. And the other one I highly recommend is by Matt Goldish called The Sabbatian Prophets. That one takes a look at Nathan of Gaza, the prophet of Sabtai Tzvi, and how he used Kabbalah and how that fits in with millenarian trends and so on. That one is really worth reading. And also David Halpern has a couple of books and classics of Western spirituality. One of them is Testimonies of Sabtai Tzvi by his followers. The other one is the writings of Abraham Michael Cardoso, who was one of the major Sabbatian thinkers, and there's a lot on the Messiah of Joseph in there.
And speaking of Messiah Ben Joseph, you did appear on a
Yeah,
previous podcast where we kind of discussed that,
yeah.
and hopefully presenting a more like say sane approach to the topic than one that was taken by a very ignorant LDS apologist who embarrassed himself on an Eastern Orthodox show not too long ago. So,
Oh no. Oh no, I know the one
yeah,
you mean. I didn't know we talked about that. Goodness.
he did, and he was correctly called up on
Oh no.
it.
Feel bad for that. But yeah,
Yeah,
Sabbatianism is just fascinating because it was one of the first syncretic religions. It drew from Judaism and Christianity and Islam. It took what it wanted to take. It kind of combined them all into one in a messianic tone. And there's so much that's interesting there. And then you have breakthroughs off of that with, Pavel Matseko wrote another book on the Frankists, the mixed multitude, which goes a lot into charlatan culture of the 18th century. And a figure who was, Jacob Frank was wild and kind of a Donald Trumpish figure for the 18th century of religion. My goodness, he told so many scatological stories. It was insane. Luther's got nothing on him.
oh, it's a bit off topic, but everyone should look up. It's on the Google the Leisure insult generator.
Oh yes, that's an old classic.
Actual quotation from the works of Luther, not just these table talks, but like the entire Luther Werke, and it's brilliant. You have to bookmark it.
It's great. That's the one thing I
I
like
mean,
about Luther.
yeah, I don't like Luther. I mean, he and Calvin deserve to burn in hell forever. I'll be
Yes.
blunt,
Oh yeah.
but uh, some person said like he was like a retard. raised up by God. So he may have been a retard, but he was our Protestant retard. Damn it.
It's true. So yeah, there's some wild stuff and all that.
Yeah. Okay, well, it doesn't seem like there's any other questions from the audience. So what we'll do is we'll end things. As I said on the chat, myself and Alan will be joining Travis Anderson, Michael Zitar, and Elix Green to review a recent sermon by James Hazelton. One of the most
double feature.
Yeah, so it's one of the most intellectually dishonest Protestant apologists I've ever come across, and that says a lot. But yeah, so just shared the link, so that will be starting in about 45 minutes. But Alan, thanks for coming on, and all the best when it comes to the Abraham conference.
Thank you.
We should definitely have you and Kraus come on if you guys want to, maybe give I'm sure there's some stuff that made the cutting room floor just for space,
right, just for
time,
space.
But you guys can definitely come on and give say different perspectives on the paper as well if you guys want to do that in the near future.
Yeah, because we'll be talking about the antiquity of Jasher and how to read it. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff we could do.
Yeah, we can definitely arrange that after you guys give the presentation in a few weeks' time. Awesome. But yeah, well, thanks for coming on. Hopefully that's been informative. And I will see you in a couple of minutes, Alan. And to everyone else, in terms of announcements, we not to get some of the dates. I will be interviewing the Creme Trends, the two former Baptists I baptized back in Missouri a few months ago. They'll be coming on. One of them's a revert to the church, and one's a former JW as well. So it's going to be an interesting interview. Dan Ellsworth will be coming on to discuss the myths of biblical scholarship in May, and I'm trying to get a date with Stephen Harper to discuss his work on the Word of Wisdom and its development. And hopefully we'll have Terrell Givens on around May or June as well. So there's some fun episodes forthcoming as well. With that, thanks guys for tuning in, and thanks again, Alan, for coming on.
Thank you.